Olivia Anderson had never sat at a school desk. She had never raised her hand in a classroom or lined up with other children at the sound of a bell. While most kids her age marked time by semesters and holidays, Olivia measured her days by the changing light outside her bedroom window. The accident had happened years ago, when she was still small enough to be lifted easily into her mother's arms. A car skidded on wet pavement, metal screamed, glass shattered, and afterward nothing was ever the same. Olivia survived, but her right leg did not recover the way the doctors had hoped. It remained weak and unreliable, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. No matter how hard she tried, it would not obey her the way it should. Now she moved with crutches, slowly and carefully, every step requiring concentration. Stairs were her greatest enemy. The apartment where she lived with her grandmother was on the 5th floor of an older building in Eugene, Oregon, one without an elevator. To get outside meant descending 10 long flights of stairs, each one a small battle. Without help, it was impossible, and help was not always available. So Olivia stayed inside. Most mornings began the same way. She woke early, before the city fully stirred, and made her way to the window. From there, she could see the narrow street below, the bare trees lining the sidewalk, and the small courtyard where neighborhood children gathered. In winter, the air was gray and damp, the kind of cold that seeped into bones rather than biting sharply. Rain often turned to slush, and sometimes, on rare mornings, a thin layer of snow covered the ground. On those days, Olivia pressed closer to the glass. She watched children run across the courtyard, their laughter drifting upward in broken fragments. They built misshapen snowmen, argued over scarves and hats, and chased one another until their cheeks turned red. Their boots left messy tracks that disappeared by afternoon. Olivia followed every movement with her eyes, her fingers resting against the cool window pane. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears did nothing but blur her view. Instead, she imagined. She pictured herself among them, standing without crutches, her legs strong and steady. In her mind, she could run. She could fall and get back up again. She could walk home from school with a backpack slung over one shoulder, complaining about homework like everyone else. Inside the apartment, it was quiet. The rooms were small but tidy, filled with signs of careful attention rather than comfort. Everything had its place because clutter made movement harder. Olivia navigated the space with practiced precision, dragging a chair where she needed it, using furniture for balance when her arms grew tired. Her grandmother, Ruth Anderson, noticed everything, even when she pretended not to. Ruth was a woman who carried warmth with her wherever she went. She smiled easily, spoke kindly, and rarely complained. To neighbors and co-workers, she seemed endlessly energetic, the sort of person who never slowed down. But Olivia knew better. She saw how Ruth's shoulders sagged when she thought no one was watching, how her hands trembled slightly after a long day. Ruth worked hard, too hard for someone her age, and she never spoke about how tired she was. She cooked, cleaned, and planned every small detail of their lives with quiet efficiency. Each morning, she helped Olivia wash and dress, tying shoes carefully and making sure the crutches were within reach before stepping away. "You sit here," Ruth would say gently, guiding her granddaughter to the window. "I'll be right back." And Olivia always waited, watching the world she could not reach. There was longing in her silence, but there was strength there too. She did not complain about what she lacked. She learned to endure, to adapt, to hope quietly. Her resilience was not loud or dramatic. It was steady, like her gaze fixed on the courtyard below, like the patience she practiced every single day. Behind the glass, life went on, and Olivia watched it all, holding on to the belief that one day, somehow, she would step into it herself. Ms. Laura Bennett arrived every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, always at the same hour. She carried a large canvas bag that pulled slightly at her shoulder, heavy with textbooks, notebooks, and loose folders. By the time she reached the 5th floor, her breath was usually uneven, but she never complained. She simply smiled when Ruth opened the door and said, "Good morning," as if the climb were nothing more than a brief inconvenience. The apartment changed when the lessons began. Ruth cleared the small table near the window, pushing it closer to the light. Ms. Bennet taped a large sheet of white paper to the wall, turning it into a makeshift board. Olivia waited patiently, already seated, her books neatly stacked in front of her. She did not fidget or ask when the lesson would start. She was always ready. From the first weeks, it became clear that Olivia was different. She absorbed information with remarkable speed, listening carefully, rarely needing things repeated. She read fluently, far beyond what was expected for her age, and remembered details with ease. When Ms. Bennet introduced a new concept, Olivia did not rush to answer. She thought, considered, then spoke with quiet confidence. Homework was never delayed. Olivia finished every assignment the same day it was given, treating it not as an obligation but as a privilege. Learning was something she guarded fiercely, as if it were a door that might close again if she looked away for too long. Ms. Bennet noticed everything. One afternoon, after Olivia completed a set of math problems without a single mistake, the teacher leaned back slightly in her chair and studied the girl in silence. There was admiration in her expression, but also concern. When the lesson ended, Olivia gathered her books and moved carefully toward her room, leaving Ruth and Ms. Bennet alone at the table. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window. "She's extraordinary," Ms. Bennet said at last. "You know that." Ruth nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She knew. She had always known. "She's already covered most of the elementary curriculum," the teacher continued. "If she were in school, she'd be bored. She needs more. She needs structure, peers, stimulation." Ruth lowered her gaze. "And there's something else," Ms. Bennet added gently. "Her condition. I've done some reading. There are treatments now. Physical therapy. Surgery in some cases. With the right care, there's a real chance she could walk more freely. She could attend school." The words hung between them, heavy and hopeful at the same time. Ruth felt her chest tighten. "Yes," she said quietly. "The doctors told us the same." Ms. Bennet waited. "It's possible," Ruth went on, forcing herself to continue. "But it costs money. More than I have. Insurance doesn't cover everything. And even what it does cover," her voice faltered. She stopped, took a breath, and tried again. "It's still too much." For a moment, the teacher said nothing. Her expression softened, sympathy replacing optimism. Ruth turned toward the window, watching the rain blur the outlines of the buildings outside. Guilt pressed against her ribs, familiar and sharp. She wondered if she had failed her granddaughter by not finding a way, by not working harder, by not somehow changing the world to fit Olivia's needs. At the same time, determination stirred beneath the helplessness. She would not give up. She could not. Potential like Olivia's should not be locked inside four walls. It should not be limited by stairs, by numbers on a medical bill, by circumstances no child had chosen. As Ms. Bennet gathered her things to leave, Ruth thanked her, her voice steady despite the storm inside her chest. When the door closed behind the teacher, Ruth stood alone in the quiet apartment, listening to Olivia's pencil moving softly in the other room. So much promise lived under this roof, and for now it remained trapped there, waiting for a chance to break free. When the apartment finally fell quiet, Ruth Anderson retreated to the small bedroom she rarely used except at night. She sat on the edge of the bed and reached for the framed photograph on the dresser. It showed a young woman with clear eyes and a familiar curve to her smile. Rebecca Anderson, her daughter, Olivia's mother. 5 years had passed since Rebecca's death, yet time had done little to soften the ache. Grief, Ruth had learned, did not fade neatly. It settled in layers, resurfacing without warning, especially in the stillness after a long day. She traced the edge of the frame with her thumb, as if the motion might summon a response, a sign, anything. Their last months together replayed in her mind with cruel clarity. They had argued before. Mothers and daughters always did. But that final argument had been different, heavier. As though something fragile had finally cracked beyond repair. Ruth had carried a secret for most of her life. A truth she had buried so deeply that even she sometimes believed it no longer mattered. But one afternoon, without planning to, she had spoken. She remembered the moment vividly. Rebecca had been sitting at the kitchen table, Olivia still small enough to nap in the next room. They were talking about the past, about Ruth's youth, about mistakes and regrets spoken lightly, as if they belonged to someone else. "There's something you should know," Ruth had said, her voice trembling before she could stop it. Rebecca had looked up, curious but unguarded. "You have a sister," Ruth told her. The words seemed unreal even as she spoke them. For a moment, Rebecca did not react. Then her expression shifted, disbelief hardening into shock. "A sister?" she asked. "What do you mean, a sister?" Ruth had closed her eyes and let the truth spill out. She spoke of being young and frightened, of a husband who had made decisions for her, of poverty and pressure and fear disguised as practicality. She spoke of the hospital room decades earlier, of a baby girl born healthy and quiet. She had a birthmark, Ruth had said softly, on her right ear, red, like it had been brushed by fire. The memory rose unbidden, sharp and intimate. The weight of that newborn in her arms, the warmth, the tiny ear, marked so distinctly she had traced it with her finger again and again, afraid she might forget it. Rebecca's face had gone pale. "You gave her up?" she asked, her voice cold. "You just gave her away?" Ruth tried to explain. She spoke of manipulation, of shame, of being told she was doing the right thing. She spoke of regret that had followed her every day since, of how she had tried to find the child months later, only to be told it was too late, that the baby had already been adopted, the record sealed. But Rebecca did not hear the pain beneath the explanation. "You didn't even try hard enough," she said, her eyes burning. "You talk about your heart, about suffering, but what about hers? What kind of mother does that?" Ruth had felt the words strike deep, each one deserved and unbearable. "I was young," she whispered. "I was wrong. I've lived with it every day." Rebecca stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't want to hear excuses," she said. "I can't believe you hid this from me, from all of us." She had taken Olivia and left that evening. Her anger sharp and final. Snow had been falling, thick and blinding, as she drove away. Ruth remembered standing at the window, watching the taillights disappear into the storm. Her chest tight with dread she could not explain. Hours later, the phone rang. The accident had been swift and unforgiving. An icy road. A truck that could not stop in time. Rebecca's final word, the doctors told her later, had been Mom. Now, years later, Ruth sat alone with the memory. The photograph, blurred by tears, she no longer tried to hide. Regret had become her constant companion, not just for the child she had lost decades earlier, but for the daughter she had failed to reconcile with in time. She whispered an apology into the quiet room, unsure who it was meant for. The past could not be changed, but its weight followed her still, shaping every step she took, every silence she kept, every choice she made from that moment on. Evergreen Table stood on a corner, just off one of Eugene's older streets, its windows framed by dark wood and warm light that spilled onto the sidewalk each evening. The restaurant had been there for decades, long enough to become part of the city's quiet memory. People came not for trends or spectacle, but for familiarity, for food that tasted the same year after year, and for the feeling that some places still knew who they were. Ruth Anderson arrived before the doors opened, as she always did. She moved through the empty dining room with practiced ease, wiping tables, straightening chairs, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerators, waking up in the kitchen. The work was physical, steady, and unforgiving, but it gave her something precious in return: routine. And routine kept the past at bay. The owner, Hannah Pierce, often arrived not long after. Hannah was young, but there was nothing careless about her. She spoke quietly, never raising her voice, and she listened more than she talked. When she walked through the dining room, she noticed details others missed: a loose floorboard, a flickering bulb, a staff member whose smile seemed forced. She thanked people by name. She asked after their families and remembered the answers. Ruth liked her immediately. Over time, she learned Hannah's story in fragments, offered without drama. Hannah had grown up in foster care, moved from home to home until she was adopted by an older couple who owned Evergreen Table. They treated her as their own, taught her the business slowly, patiently. When they passed away, the restaurant became hers, not as a gift, but as a responsibility she carried seriously. "I don't want to change much," Hannah once said, gesturing around the dining room. "This place already means something to people." Ruth understood that instinct well. Hannah's husband, Daniel Pierce, was nothing like her. He appeared at the restaurant irregularly, but when he did, his presence dominated the room. Tall, sharp-featured, always dressed as though he were going somewhere more important. Daniel spoke loudly and moved through the space as if it belonged to him by right. His smiles never reached his eyes. Ruth noticed how Hannah's posture shifted when he entered. Her shoulders tensed, her voice softened further, as though she were bracing herself. Daniel treated the staff with open contempt. He criticized small mistakes publicly, mocked people's accents and ages, and made jokes that landed like insults. Where Hannah offered quiet guidance, Daniel demanded obedience. One afternoon, the tension boiled over. Ruth was mopping near the kitchen entrance when Daniel stormed through. His phone pressed to his ear. He turned sharply, collided with the bucket, and water spilled across the floor, splashing onto his trousers. He looked down, then up, his face darkening. "Are you blind?" he snapped, pointing at Ruth. "Watch where you're going." "I'm sorry," Ruth said calmly. "I didn't see you coming." Daniel scoffed, loudly enough for the nearby staff to hear. "Of course you didn't. People like you never do." He gestured toward the mess. "You'll pay for this. The pants, the delay, everything. I'll have it taken out of your pay." The words hung heavy in the room. Ruth felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, the urge to respond sharply pressing against years of practiced restraint. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her job mattered. Olivia mattered more. Before she could speak, Hannah stepped forward. "That's enough," she said, her voice steady but firm. "It was an accident." Daniel turned on her, his expression incredulous. "You're taking her side?" "I'm saying this ends now," Hannah replied. "Go upstairs." For a moment, it seemed he might refuse. Then he laughed sharply, shook his head, and walked away, throwing one last glare over his shoulder. Ruth knelt to clean the spill, her hands steady despite the tremor beneath her skin. She said nothing, but unease settled deep within her, not for herself, but for Hannah. As she worked, Ruth glanced toward the stairs Daniel had taken, and then back to Hannah, who stood silently, her face carefully composed. Something about this marriage was wrong. Ruth felt it with the same certainty she had learned to trust over a lifetime. And she feared that whatever darkness lived behind Daniel's smile had not yet fully revealed itself. It happened without warning, in a moment so ordinary that Ruth would later struggle to remember what had come just before it. She was finishing up in Hannah's office, wiping down the desk and straightening a stack of papers left behind after closing. The room was quiet, the hum of the building settling into night. Hannah stood near the door, slipping on her coat, her movements unhurried. She reached up absently and gathered her hair, sweeping it over one shoulder as she searched for her keys. Ruth looked up. For a fraction of a second, her mind refused to understand what her eyes were seeing. Then the world seemed to tilt. On Hannah's right ear, just where the curve met the neck, was a red mark. Not faint, not hidden, distinct, unmistakable. It spread like a soft flame against pale skin, shaped exactly as Ruth remembered. Her breath caught. The cloth slipped from her hand and fell to the floor. Ruth swayed, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk as the room narrowed around her. A rushing sound filled her ears, loud enough to drown out thought. Her heart pounded so violently she wondered if Hannah could hear it. She had seen that mark before. Not once, not twice, but countless times. In the dim light of a hospital room decades earlier, she remembered tracing it with a trembling finger, memorizing it in case the rest of the child was taken from her forever. She remembered thinking that no matter where that baby went, she would know her by that mark alone. And now it was here, standing in front of her, alive. Ruth forced herself to breathe. "Hannah," she heard herself say, though the name came out barely above a whisper. Hannah turned, concern flickering across her face. "Are you all right?" Ruth lowered her gaze immediately, afraid that if she looked again, she would lose control entirely. Her knees felt weak, as though they might fold beneath her. "I'm fine," she said, "just a little dizzy." Hannah stepped closer, her voice gentle. "You should sit down. I can get you some water." "No," Ruth replied too quickly, then softened her tone. "No, it's all right. It happens sometimes." Hannah hesitated, then nodded. She gathered her things and moved toward the door. "Don't stay late," she said. "If you're not feeling well, go home." Ruth managed a small smile. "I will." When Hannah left, the door clicking softly shut behind her, Ruth sank into the chair she had just cleaned. Her hands shook openly now. Tears blurred her vision, but she did not let them fall. It was her. There was no doubt. Not after all these years. Not with that mark. 1,000 thoughts collided in her mind at once. Should she run after Hannah? Call out to her? Say the words she had swallowed for decades? The truth pressed against her chest, desperate for release. But fear rose just as quickly. Hannah had a life, a history, people she called family. Ruth was a cleaner in her restaurant, nothing more. To speak now could shatter everything. Trust, stability, the fragile peace Hannah carried with her. What if she was rejected again? What if the truth caused harm rather than healing? Ruth closed her eyes. Love, she realized, was not always loud. Sometimes it was the decision to step back, to protect rather than claim, to wait even when every part of you wanted to reach out and hold on. She wiped her face, stood slowly, and returned the cloth to its place. For now, silence was her choice, not because the truth mattered less, but because Hannah mattered more. The announcement came on a quiet morning, before the restaurant opened to the public. Hannah gathered the staff in the dining room, standing near the long table that usually held reservation books and folded menus. She wore black, simple and unadorned, and her hair was pulled back more tightly than usual. The warmth she carried on most days seemed dimmed, as though someone had lowered the lights inside her. "My grandfather passed away," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clasped together, fingers interlaced as if holding herself in place. "He was very ill this past year. He didn't always recognize me toward the end, but he was a good man. This restaurant was his life. It meant everything to him." She paused, took a breath. "We'll hold a memorial gathering here this evening. Nothing elaborate, just a moment to remember him properly." The staff murmured their condolences. Heads bowed. A few hands reached out briefly to touch Hannah's arm as the group began to disperse. The restaurant, usually alive with anticipation before a busy night, felt subdued, as though it were holding its breath. That evening, evergreen table filled with a different kind of noise. There was no music, no laughter spilling freely across the room. Guests spoke in lowered voices. Glasses clinked softly. Plates were set down with extra care. Grief moved through the space alongside routine. A strange pairing that felt both respectful and uneasy. Hannah moved among the tables, accepting quiet condolences, thanking people for coming. Her eyes were red but dry. She listened when others spoke of her grandfather, nodded at familiar stories, smiled faintly when someone remembered something kind. Her grief was private, contained, but unmistakable. Daniel, on the other hand, treated the gathering as something else entirely. He poured himself a drink before Hannah finished speaking to the first group of guests. He stood apart, leaning against the bar, watching the room with an expression Ruth had learned to distrust. When he finally joined Hannah at the table reserved for family, his words cut through the solemn mood like a sharp blade. "Well," he said, lifting his glass to a long life, and to what he left behind. Hannah's jaw tightened. "Daniel," she said quietly, "please." He chuckled, waving his hand dismissively. "I'm just saying, he lived well, and now everything moves forward. That's how it works." As the evening wore on, Daniel drank more freely. His voice grew louder, his jokes cruder. He spoke openly about the property Hannah's grandfather had owned, about paperwork and valuations, about how long probate might take. He seemed more animated discussing assets than acknowledging the man who had died. Ruth watched from the edges of the room, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, keeping herself busy. She noticed how Hannah's shoulders hunched slightly each time Daniel spoke, how her gaze drifted away as though she were retreating inward. Then there was the waitress. Madison Clark had only been working at Evergreen Table for a short time, young and eager, her smile practiced but sincere. Ruth noticed the way Daniel's eyes followed her movements, how his attention lingered longer than it should have. Madison laughed too quickly at his remarks, her cheeks flushing as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. At one point, Daniel leaned close to her, whispering something Ruth could not hear. Madison glanced around, then laughed again, uncertain and flattered all at once. Hannah did not see it, or perhaps she chose not to. Ruth did. She saw everything. She saw how Daniel's hand brushed Madison's arm as she passed, how his smile sharpened when Hannah turned away, how grief in his hands became a mask for indulgence and entitlement. Ruth said nothing. She had learned long ago that speaking at the wrong moment could do more harm than good. Instead, she observed, storing each detail away. Her silence was not approval. It was vigilance. As the gathering drew to a close and guests slowly departed, Ruth watched Hannah stand alone near the window, staring out into the darkened street. Daniel laughed loudly behind her, already planning what came next. Grief had revealed more than sorrow that night. It had exposed the fractures beneath the surface, and Ruth, quiet as ever, saw them all. By the time the holidays approached, Evergreen Table had begun to change. Evergreen garlands were draped carefully along the windows. Soft white lights traced the wooden beams overhead. A tall Christmas tree stood near the entrance, decorated simply, without excess, its ornaments catching the glow from the dining room lamps. The restaurant felt warmer, quieter, as if it were preparing itself for reflection rather than celebration. On one of those evenings, Ruth brought Olivia with her. The weather had turned cold and damp, the kind of winter night that made the streets glisten under streetlights. Olivia moved slowly through the dining room on her crutches, her eyes wide with curiosity. She rarely left the apartment, and places like this felt almost unreal to her. The hum of voices, the scent of food, the gentle clatter of plates. Hannah noticed her immediately. "I didn't know you had a granddaughter," she said, crouching slightly so she could meet Olivia at eye level. Her voice softened, losing its professional edge. "Hello there." Olivia smiled shyly. "Hi." "She's very smart," Ruth said quietly, unable to hide the pride in her voice. "Top of her lessons." Hannah's eyes brightened. "Is that so?" She asked Olivia a simple question, then another. Olivia answered without hesitation, her voice calm and precise. Hannah laughed, surprised and delighted, and reached out to gently pat Olivia's shoulder. "You're amazing," she said. "You know that." For a moment, Ruth watched them together, the young woman and the child, and felt a strange stillness settle inside her. There was something mirrored there, something unspoken, a recognition that went beyond words. As evening fell, the memorial dinner began. The table was set neatly, glasses aligned with care. The atmosphere was subdued but respectful, a continuation of mourning rather than a departure from it. Daniel arrived late. He took his seat with an air of impatience, glancing around the room as though measuring its worth. When the server poured wine, he lifted his glass and cleared his throat. "Well," he said, his voice carrying farther than necessary, "we should drink. To your grandfather, Hannah. To a long life. And to what he left behind." Hannah frowned. "Daniel." "What?" he replied, shrugging. "It's true. He had good taste. And good property." The words landed heavily, but Hannah said nothing. She simply lowered her gaze. At that moment, Ruth asked Olivia to help with a small task. A napkin had fallen near the table, and Ruth wanted it placed properly. Olivia moved carefully, concentrating on her footing as she approached the table. She reached out, steadying herself against the edge. In the process, her elbow brushed the stem of one glass, nudging it slightly. Trying to fix it, she adjusted both glasses, placing them neatly side by side, unaware that she had switched their positions. "No, wait," Daniel said sharply, then stopped himself. Olivia looked up, startled. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "It's fine," Hannah said, offering her a reassuring smile. "Thank you for helping." She lifted the glass in front of her and took a small sip. Daniel froze. The change in him was immediate and unmistakable. Color drained from his face. His hand tightened around his own glass, knuckles whitening. He stared at Hannah, his eyes wide, his breathing uneven. "Don't," he said suddenly. "Stop." Hannah paused, the glass hovering near her lips. "What's wrong?" Daniel stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I said stop." The room fell silent. Hannah looked from his face to the glass in her hand, confusion giving way to something colder, sharper. She set the glass down slowly. "Why?" she asked. Daniel's gaze darted around the room, as though searching for an escape that did not exist. His mouth opened, then closed again. Sweat beaded at his temples. Understanding settled over Hannah with chilling clarity. She picked up the glass again, studying the liquid inside. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. "This isn't just wine, is it?" Daniel lunged forward, knocking the glass from her hand. It shattered against the floor, sending shards across the tiles. Ruth moved instantly, stepping between Olivia and the broken glass, pulling her back. Hannah stood very still. "You tried to poison me," she said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Daniel backed away, stammering, his composure gone. Without another word, he turned and fled, pushing through the doors and out into the night. The restaurant remained silent. Hannah looked down at the spilled wine, then up at Ruth, her eyes steady, resolute. What had nearly happened required no drama, no raised voices. The truth had revealed itself through fear, through reaction, through a child's innocent step that had changed everything. Daniel Pierce did not return. The doors of Evergreen Table swung shut behind him, letting in a rush of cold air before settling back into silence. No one moved to follow. No one spoke. His humiliation lingered in the room like a foul odor, unmistakable and impossible to ignore. Whatever explanation he might have offered no longer mattered. His fear had said everything for him. Hannah remained standing by the table, her hands resting lightly on its edge. Her breathing was slow and controlled, but something in her expression had changed. Shock had given way to clarity. She turned to Ruth. "You knew," Hannah said quietly. It was not a question. Before it happened, you knew something was wrong. Ruth did not answer immediately. She glanced down at Olivia, who stood close by her side, eyes wide and confused. Gently, Ruth guided her toward a chair and whispered that everything was all right, that she should sit and wait. Only when Olivia was settled safely away did Ruth turn back to Hannah. Hannah stepped closer, lowering her voice. "How did you know?" she asked again. "How did you recognize the danger before anyone else?" Ruth's hands trembled. She clasped them together, then released them, as if searching for steadiness that would not come. "There are things," Ruth said slowly, "a mother never forgets." Hannah frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Ruth lifted her hand. The movement was hesitant, almost fearful. She stopped just short of Hannah's face, then gently touched the edge of her right ear, her fingers brushing the skin with reverence and care. Hannah inhaled sharply. "That mark," Ruth said. Her voice wavered, but she did not stop. "I've known it all my life." Hannah stepped back, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" Ruth looked at her fully now. Years of restraint broke free at last. "I am your mother." The words fell between them, heavy and irrevocable. Hannah shook her head, slowly. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." Ruth did not interrupt. She knew disbelief was part of the truth's first arrival. "I was young," Ruth said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "Too young. I was pressured, frightened, convinced that giving you up was the only way to survive. They told me it was for the best. They told me you would be better off without me." She swallowed hard. "I held you," she continued. "I saw that mark on your ear and traced it again and again, because I was afraid it would be the only part of you I would ever remember. When I tried to find you later, I was told you were gone, adopted, the record sealed. I lived with that loss every day." Tears slid down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. "I never stopped looking for you," Ruth said. "Not with my eyes, with my heart." Hannah felt the room tilt. Memories she had never questioned rose suddenly to the surface, the absence of answers, the sense of having come from nowhere, the feeling that something essential had always been missing. Her knees weakened. She reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. "You knew," Hannah said hoarsely, "all this time, and you didn't say anything." "I was afraid," Ruth admitted. "Afraid of hurting you. Afraid of taking something from you instead of giving. You had a life. Parents who loved you. A place in the world. I didn't want to destroy that." Hannah's chest tightened as grief rushed in, raw and overwhelming. She thought of her adoptive parents, of the grandfather she had just buried, of the years she had spent wondering who she was meant to be. "Why now?" she asked. Ruth met her gaze. "Because today I couldn't stay silent anymore. Because you were in danger. And because loving you meant protecting you, even if it meant losing you again." For a long moment, Hannah said nothing. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You should have told me," she said softly, "but I understand why you didn't." Her voice broke, and she did not stop it. "I forgive you." The words came without hesitation, without conditions. Hannah reached out and wrapped her arms around Ruth, holding her tightly, as if afraid she might disappear. Ruth clung to her in return, the years of separation collapsing into a single moment of truth. They stood there together, mother and daughter at last, not bound by obligation or blood alone, but by choice, forgiveness, and a truth finally spoken aloud. Christmas arrived without fanfare. There were no loud announcements, no dramatic changes in fortune overnight. The city simply grew quieter, the streets softened by mist and cold air. Evergreen Table closed early on Christmas Eve, its lights dimmed. The tree near the entrance glowing faintly in the empty room. For the first time in years, Ruth felt no urgency pulling her back there. The restaurant would wait. At home, the apartment looked much the same as it always had, but something within it had shifted. The silence no longer pressed so heavily. Olivia sat near the window, a small artificial tree beside her, decorated with paper ornaments she had cut herself. She watched the street below as she always did, but now there was anticipation in her gaze instead of quiet resignation. A knock came at the door. Ruth opened it to find two familiar figures standing in the hallway, bundled in winter coats, faces bright with poorly concealed excitement. Ms. Laura Bennett wore a red scarf and a felt hat, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Beside her stood a man in a Santa Claus costume that sat slightly crooked on his frame. "Well," Ms. Bennett said, smiling broadly, "we heard there was a very special student here." Olivia's eyes widened. "Ms. Bennett." The man in the Santa suit gave an exaggerated bow. "And I'm just here to carry the heavy things," he said cheerfully. They stepped inside, laughter filling the small space. "MS." Bennett knelt in front of Olivia and placed a large box on the table. "This is for you," she said. "For learning, for exploring, for all the things you're going to do." Inside was a laptop carefully wrapped, its surface smooth and unfamiliar beneath Olivia's fingers. "MS." Bennett explained that it was already loaded with books, lessons, and documentaries, history, science, stories from places Olivia had only imagined. "So you won't feel alone while you recover," she said gently. "And so you'll never stop learning." Olivia hugged her without hesitation, her crutches clattering softly against the chair. Ruth watched, her throat tightening, gratitude swelling until it almost hurt. Later that evening, Hannah arrived. She did not bring extravagance, only warmth. She sat beside Olivia, asking about her favorite subjects, listening intently as Olivia spoke with growing confidence. Then, quietly, she turned to Ruth. "The appointments are scheduled," Hannah said. "Specialists, physical therapy, surgery if they recommend it, whatever she needs." Ruth stared at her, stunned. "I don't know how." "You don't need to," Hannah interrupted gently. "This isn't charity. This is family." The word settled over Ruth like a blessing. There were no contracts, no obligations spoken aloud. Hannah's choice was deliberate and unforced. She had stepped into this role not because of blood alone, but because she wanted to be there. That night, after everyone had gone, Ruth sat beside Olivia as she fell asleep, the soft glow of the Christmas lights reflecting off the window. For the first time in years, Ruth allowed herself to breathe fully. The guilt that had lived inside her for so long did not vanish entirely, but it loosened its grip. It no longer defined her every thought. Healing, Ruth realized, did not arrive as a miracle. It came quietly, through presence, through forgiveness, through people choosing one another again and again. And for the first time in a very long while, that felt like enough. Daniel Pierce did not come back. There were no dramatic confrontations, no courtroom scenes, no public reckoning played out for an audience. His absence spoke more clearly than any apology ever could. The restaurant moved on. So did Hannah. Justice arrived quietly, without spectacle, in the simple fact that he no longer had a place in her life. Hannah took time to rebuild, not in haste but with intention. She returned to Evergreen Table with a steadier presence, making decisions with clarity rather than compromise. The restaurant felt different under her guidance, not louder or grander, just calmer. Boundaries were set. Respect became non-negotiable. The space she created reflected the woman she was becoming, thoughtful, grounded, and unafraid to stand alone. Olivia's days began to change as well. Medical appointments filled the calendar, followed by therapy sessions that demanded patience and persistence. Progress came slowly, sometimes frustratingly so, but it came. Each small victory mattered. The crutches remained close at hand, but hope no longer felt like a fragile idea. It felt planned for. There were conversations about school, not as a distant dream, but as a real future. Teachers were contacted, schedules discussed, supplies chosen. Olivia listened carefully, absorbing every detail, her excitement tempered by focus. She did not rush toward what lay ahead. She prepared for it. Ruth watched all of this with a quiet sense of awe. Time had not given her the chance to undo her mistakes, but it had offered something else, perspective. She saw now that forgiveness did not erase the past. It allowed life to continue without being ruled by it. The guilt she had carried for decades no longer defined her. It existed, yes, but it no longer commanded her every breath. Family, Ruth understood, was not a single moment or a single choice. It was built over time, through restraint as much as action, through waiting when silence was necessary, and speaking only when truth could finally be heard without destroying what mattered most. She had learned that courage was not always loud. Sometimes it looked like endurance, like protecting someone even when they did not yet know they needed protection, like choosing love that did not demand ownership in return. Hannah, Olivia, and Ruth found their rhythm together, not because everything had been resolved, but because enough had been. The rest would unfold in its own time. For those listening to this story, there is something to consider. Not all strength announces itself. Not all justice arrives with noise. Often, the most meaningful changes happen quietly, through moral restraint, through delayed truth, through kindness that works patiently in the background. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on it. What does forgiveness mean in your life? Who do you consider family by blood, by choice, or by both? And have you ever been given a second chance or offered one to someone else? We invite you to share your thoughts and experiences. Sometimes, the stories we tell one another help us see our own lives more clearly, because in the end, what remains is not what was lost, but what we choose to build from it.